Kimberly Cargill. How far would someone go to silence a witness? Most people think testifying in court means facing tough questions, maybe feeling embarrassed, possibly losing a custody battle. But for Kimberly Cargill, the prospect of her babysitter speaking truthfully to a judge meant something entirely different. It meant eliminating the one person whose testimony could expose what she'd done to her own children. In June 2010, this Texas woman made a choice that would transform a simple custody hearing into a capital murder case, proving that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers, but from those trusted to protect the most vulnerable among us. Kimberly Diane Cargill grew up in Texas and became a licensed vocational nurse, a profession built on caring for others. She married and had 4 sons, presenting herself as a devoted mother. But according to testimony from her own children, life inside their White House home told a darker story. Her sons described a household where fear replaced comfort, where they endured physical mistreatment regularly. Medical professionals later documented that Cargill struggled with borderline personality disorder combined with narcissistic and antisocial tendencies. One psychologist testified that individuals with this combination of conditions can appear charming on the surface while lacking genuine empathy, capable of manipulating others without remorse. By 2010, Child Protective Services had opened investigations into allegations surrounding Cargill's treatment of her children. In March of that year, authorities removed her 2 younger sons, Luke and Zach, from her custody and placed them with relatives. The state's involvement intensified when Cargill violated a temporary custody agreement on May 18, 2010. She picked up her son Luke from daycare, but refused to return him to her mother, as required. A custody hearing was scheduled for June 23, 2010, where a judge would determine the permanent placement of her children. Cherry Walker entered this situation as an unlikely witness whose testimony could prove decisive. Cherry was 39 years old, but functioned at the mental capacity of a 9-year-old child. Despite her developmental challenges, she lived independently with support from caregivers and worked as a babysitter. She cared for Cargill's 4-year-old son with genuine affection, providing him with stability he rarely experienced at home. Cherry was incapable of lying, a trait her family described as both beautiful and dangerous. When authorities subpoenaed her to testify at the custody hearing, her honesty meant she would describe exactly what she had witnessed. Cargill understood this perfectly. Court records show she told Cherry not to appear at the hearing and promised to hide her at her house. But Cherry had already received the subpoena, and her involvement in the case was documented. On June 18, 2010, 5 days before the scheduled hearing, Cargill took Cherry to dinner at a restaurant. What happened next would become the subject of conflicting narratives that continue even now. The following morning, a passerby discovered a body on the side of Oscar Burkett Road in Smith County. The remains had been doused with lighter fluid and set on fire. It took 4 days to identify Cherry Walker through dental records. Her father Guthrie spent that agonizing Father's Day calling the sheriff's office repeatedly, hoping the body wasn't his daughter. Tragically, his worst fears were confirmed. An autopsy revealed Cherry had died from asphyxiation, though the exact method remained unclear because of the condition of her remains. Within the same month, investigators identified Cargill as their primary suspect. They found her DNA on Cherry's body and tracked her movements through witness statements and physical evidence. Cargill was arrested and initially held on the felony injury to a child charge before being formally charged with capital murder on July 31, 2010. Her trial began on May 8, 2012, in Smith County. Cargill took the stand in her own defense, offering an explanation that would form the basis of her appeals for years afterward. She claimed Cherry suffered an epileptic seizure while they were driving home after dinner. Instead of calling for medical help, Cargill said she panicked. She admitted to setting Cherry's body on fire, explaining she wanted to eliminate any DNA evidence that might connect her to the remains. She maintained throughout the trial that Cherry's passing was accidental and that her only crime was an irrational response to panic. The jury heard testimony from Cargill's other children describing years of mistreatment. They learned about the timing of the custody hearing and Cherry's subpoena. They reviewed forensic evidence showing Cherry's asphyxiation. On May 31st, 2012, the jury unanimously recommended execution. Judge Jack Skeen formally imposed the sentence on June 7th, 2012. Cherry's family attended the sentencing. Her stepmother, Ruan Walker, addressed Cargill directly, telling her that Cherry had loved her and her son. She described seeing Cherry's body in the morgue, her eyebrows singed from the fire. She spoke of being denied the chance to dress Cherry in a beautiful pink dress for burial, left instead with only a black body bag. Despite this, she told Cargill the family didn't hate her, only pitied her. Cargill filed multiple appeals arguing her trial attorneys should have presented expert testimony about sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, a rare condition that might have supported her seizure claim. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected these arguments in 2014 and again in 2017. The Supreme Court declined to review her case in 2017. She remains confined to the Patrick O'Daniel unit, where Texas houses women awaiting execution. She has no scheduled date yet. Susan Wright. There are moments in a marriage when you look at your partner and wonder who they really are behind the smile. But what if the person sleeping next to you at night has already decided you won't see another sunrise? What if the bed you share becomes the very place where everything ends? In Northwest Harris County, Texas, the Wright family appeared to be living the American dream. Jeff and Susan Wright had two beautiful children, Bradley and Kaylee, and their suburban home in the White Oak Bend subdivision seemed to whisper promises of backyard barbecues and soccer games on Saturday mornings. Neighbors waved. Friends visited. Life moved forward like any other family's. Yet behind closed doors, something far different was brewing, something that would soon transform this ordinary household into one of the most talked about cases in modern American history. Susan Lucille Wright was born on April 24th, 1976 in Houston. Her early life took unexpected turns. At 17, she worked briefly as a dancer, but by 1997, she had found work as a waitress in Galveston. That's where she met Jeff Wright, a man 8 years her senior who seemed charming and successful. Their relationship moved quickly. By 1998, they were married, with Susan 8.5 months pregnant with their first child. A daughter would follow a few years later, completing what looked like a picture-perfect family. But was it perfect? That question would become the heart of one of Texas's most controversial trials. On January 13, 2003, something happened in the Wright home that would change everything. The details that emerged would both horrify and divide public opinion. According to prosecutors, 26-year-old Susan had carefully planned what would happen that night. She allegedly seduced her 34-year-old husband, tied him to their bed with neckties and cloth sashes, and then committed an act so brutal that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to process what they saw. Jeff Wright had been attacked 193 times with 2 different knives. The number itself is staggering. Think about what it takes to do that. Each motion, each decision to continue. The medical examiner would later discover that the tip of one knife had broken off inside Jeff's skull. There were injuries from his head down to his genitals. Red candle wax was found on his body. The bedroom walls, ceiling, floors, and even the ironing board were splattered with evidence of what had occurred. But Susan wasn't finished. She dragged her husband's body to the backyard and buried him in a hole that had been dug for a fountain. Then she painted the bedroom walls, attempting to erase what had happened. The very next day, she filed a domestic violence report against Jeff and obtained a restraining order, creating a paper trail that might explain his absence. 5 days passed before Susan called her attorney, Neil Davis, and confessed. On January 24th, she turned herself into authorities at the Harris County Courthouse. When police found Jeff's partially exposed body, their family dog had been digging at the grave. The trial that followed in February 2004 became a media sensation. Court TV broadcast it gavel to gavel across the nation. The question everyone wanted answered was simple yet profound. Why? Susan's defense team painted her as a victim who had finally fought back. Taking the witness stand with tears streaming down her face, Susan testified about years of alleged mistreatment. She claimed Jeff used substances that made him angry and unpredictable. She said he hurt her physically and emotionally. On the night in question, she testified that Jeff had come home after a boxing lesson, agitated and threatening. She claimed he had produced a knife first, and that she wrestled it from him in self-defense. When she started defending herself, she said she couldn't stop because she knew if she did, he would take the knife back and end her life. But Assistant District Attorney Kelly Siegler told a completely different story. In one of the most dramatic courtroom moments in Texas history, Siegler had the actual bed from the murder scene brought into the courtroom. She removed her shoes, straddled a colleague who was lying on the bed, and demonstrated how she believed Susan had committed the act with Jeff, helpless and tied down. Siegler argued that Susan wanted Jeff's $200,000 life insurance policy and didn't want a divorce. She pointed to Susan's past work as a dancer and questioned whether her courtroom tears were genuine or rehearsed. After more than 5 hours of deliberation on March 3, 2004, the jury convicted Susan Wright of murder. She received 25 years in prison, though this would later be reduced to 20 years after appeals courts found issues with her original legal representation. Susan's story didn't end behind bars. She was denied release twice before finally being granted freedom in July 2020. On December 30th of that year, at age 44, Susan Wright walked out of the Lane Murray unit in Gatesville, Texas. When reporters approached her at her family's home on her first day of freedom, she begged them for one thing she hadn't had in nearly 17 years: privacy. The case continues to raise questions about truth, justice, and what really happens behind closed doors in seemingly normal homes across America. Barbara Opal, what price would you put on trust? For some people, trust isn't something to be honored, but rather something to be traded, bartered, and weaponized. In the spring of 2001, a woman in Everett, Washington, discovered she could purchase violence for the cost of a used car, a few $100s, and the promise of roller skates. Barbara Opal didn't just cross moral boundaries. She erased them entirely, recruiting children to commit an act that would shatter multiple families and leave a community questioning how someone entrusted with caring for the elderly could orchestrate such a betrayal. Barbara Marie Opal was born in May 1963 and grew up in Bothell, Washington, in a mobile home park. Her childhood offered little stability, and she carried that pattern into adulthood. By November 2000, she was bouncing between motels in Snohomish County with her 3 children, struggling to maintain any sense of security. That same month, she met Jerry Dwayne Hyman at a Dairy Queen. Hyman, a 64-year-old retired Boeing company worker, was searching for someone to care for his 89-year-old mother, Evelyn, who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He needed help, and Barbara needed a place to stay. Within weeks, she and her children moved into the basement of his home on 22nd Street in Everett. At first glance, the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. Jerry got assistance with his mother's care, and Barbara secured housing for her family. But beneath the surface, tension grew. Barbara later claimed that Jerry regularly berated her and her children with harsh language and disparaging comments. Whether these claims held truth or served as justification for what came next remains debated. What became undeniable was that Barbara began telling friends and acquaintances that she wished Jerry was gone. These weren't casual complaints. They were declarations that foreshadowed deliberate planning. Jerry had recently sold a house and kept approximately $40,000 in his bank account. For Barbara, this represented a solution to all her financial struggles. But accessing that money required removing Jerry from the picture. Rather than leave or find another caregiving position, Barbara conceived a plan that would involve the most vulnerable people in her orbit: teenagers. She started with her own 13-year-old daughter, Heather, convincing her to recruit others. Heather, wanting a dirt bike and eager to please her mother, agreed to bring in more participants. The group assembled over the following days. Jeffrey Grote, a 17-year-old who worked at a local skating rink, had recently begun dating Heather. He was promised a car and fashionable clothing. Kyle Boston, age 14, and his 13-year-old cousin Mike joined after being offered $300 to split between them. 14-year-old Mariam Oliver, Heather's best friend, was promised skating passes. These weren't hardened criminals. They were children from unstable backgrounds, manipulated by an adult who understood exactly which incentives would work on young, impressionable minds. On the evening of April 13th, 2001, the five teenagers waited for Jerry to return home. When he walked through the door, they ambushed him with baseball bats and knives. From the basement, Barbara reportedly shouted encouragement while her two younger children, ages 7 and 11, remained nearby. After the attack, Barbara directed these younger children to bring mops to clean the blood and sheets to wrap the body. The group then transported Jerry's remains to the Tulalip Indian Reservation, where they pushed him into a ravine approximately 10 miles from his home. Meanwhile, Jerry's mother, Evelyn, was left alone in the house, neglected and dehydrated. Barbara didn't waste time mourning. She used Jerry's credit card to rent rooms at the Roadway Inn for herself and the teenagers, treating them to dinner as if they'd completed a business transaction. She accessed his bank account, paying the teenagers their promised amounts and securing 6 months' rent on a duplex. She purchased clothing for Jeffrey using Jerry's credit cards. The spending spree continued until investigators began tracing the financial transactions. Police arrested Barbara and the five teenagers on April 19, 2001. One of Barbara's uninvolved children led investigators to Jerry's body the following day. An autopsy confirmed that Jerry had sustained over 20 wounds from both blunt force trauma and sharp instruments. The case drew national attention, not just for the crime's nature, but for the disturbing fact that a mother had enlisted her own child and other minors to carry out such an act. Barbara's trial began on March 20, 2003, in Snohomish County Superior Court. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, which would have made her the first woman in Washington state history to receive such a sentence. Her defense team argued that she suffered from brain damage that impaired her judgment and prevented her from fully comprehending consequences. Mental health experts testified about her cognitive limitations, while her own sister described her as immature and disrespectful. The jury found Barbara guilty of aggravated first-degree murder on April 8, 2003. However, when faced with deciding between execution and life imprisonment without parole, they chose the latter. Barbara smiled when the verdict was read. She showed no remorse during proceedings, even declining an opportunity to ask jurors to spare her life. She currently serves her sentence at the Washington Correction Center for Women in Gig Harbor, where she will remain for the rest of her life. The teenagers received varying sentences based on their ages and levels of involvement. Jeffrey Grote received 50 years, later reduced to 21. Kyle Boston received 18 years and has since been released. Mariam Oliver received 22 years, later reduced to 20. Heather Opal also received 22 years, later reduced to 20, and was released in 2022. Mike Boston, tried as a juvenile, was released at age 21. Brookie Lee West. What if the stories whispered in your childhood became the blueprint for the rest of your life? What if darkness wasn't something you fell into, but something you were carefully taught, lesson by lesson, until it became all you knew? In the glittering expanse of Las Vegas, where neon lights promise transformation and rebirth, one woman's story would reveal that some shadows are inherited, and some transformations lead not to freedom, but to something far more sinister. Brookie Lee West was born on June 28, 1953, into a household where normalcy was a foreign concept. Her father, Leroy Smith, was a United States Army veteran turned El Paso police officer, but his credentials masked a troubling reality. He identified as a white supremacist and practiced Satanism, filling their California home with occult rituals and dark teachings. Her mother, Christine Smith, struggled with her own demons. Born in 1932 to first-generation Eastern European immigrants, Christine had endured a childhood marked by exploitation and hardship. By the time she married Leroy, she had already learned that survival sometimes meant compromise, and her parenting style reflected the chaos of her own upbringing. Together, they created an environment where their two children Brookie and her younger brother Travis learned early that family bonds could be both complicated and dangerous. Despite the turmoil at home, Brookie managed to graduate high school and eventually carved out a successful career as a technical writer in Silicon Valley. On the surface, she appeared to have escaped the dysfunction of her childhood. She split her time between California and Las Vegas, building what looked like a respectable professional life. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, patterns from her past continued to repeat themselves in ways that would eventually demand attention from law enforcement. In 1993, Travis Smith disappeared. No body was ever recovered. But investigators grew suspicious when someone checked into Santa Clara Valley Medical Center using Travis's social security number, and the hospital bill was sent to an address where Brookie was living. The authorities couldn't prove anything, but the questions lingered. Then, in 1994, Brookie's husband, Howard Simon St. John, was found deceased along the side of a road in Sequoia National Forest. He had been shot multiple times, and like in cases that would follow, there were disturbing details about how his body had been positioned. Once again, no charges were filed, but the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. While Brookie's father Leroy was battling cancer in 1996, another family member became a target. Diane Smith was allegedly attacked with a stun gun. Brookie was arrested, but released after a few months. The family was fracturing, and Christine Smith, now struggling with severe alcohol dependency, found herself increasingly isolated. In February 1998, Christine Smith vanished. When neighbors asked about her whereabouts, Brookie offered a simple explanation. Her mother had moved to Texas to live with Travis. Given Christine's health issues and history of instability, the story seemed plausible enough that people didn't press further. Life continued. Months turned into years. And all the while, Brookie was making regular ATM withdrawals from her mother's bank account, collecting Christine's $1,000 monthly Social Security checks as though nothing had changed. On February 5, 2001, Bill Unruh, the general manager of Canyon Gate Mini Storage in Las Vegas, detected a disturbing odor coming from storage unit 317. When he opened it, he discovered a 55-gallon trash can that was leaking an unidentifiable liquid. The smell was overwhelming. When police arrived and began unwrapping layer after layer of plastic, duct tape, and cellophane, they discovered something that would shock even veteran detectives. Inside was the severely decomposed body of Christine Smith. She had been sealed in that container for nearly 3 years. A white plastic bag had been knotted tightly around her head, covering her nose and mouth. Next to the makeshift tomb, investigators found books on witchcraft, Satanism, and black magic. The storage unit had been rented jointly by Christine and Brookie on June 26, 1998, just months after Christine's disappearance. When detectives searched Brookie's apartment, they found Christine's bank statements and discovered the pattern of ongoing withdrawals. They also found the duct tape that matched what was used to seal the garbage can. Brookie was arrested on September 5, 2001. Her explanation was that Christine had passed away from natural causes and she had panicked, choosing to hide the body rather than report what had happened. But forensic entomologist Neil Haskell from St. Joseph's College examined the remains and found something telling. The absence of blowflies and presence of coffin flies indicated that Christine's body had been placed in the sealed container either immediately after her passing or possibly even before. The trial began on July 3, 2001, and prosecutor Frank Como described it as the most bizarre case he had ever handled. Despite Christine's documented health problems, including severe asthma and a lung age that had once tested at 132 years, prosecutors argued that her medical conditions didn't explain her ending. The plastic bag tied around her face suggested something more deliberate. Because of the advanced decomposition, medical examiners couldn't determine an exact cause, but the circumstances painted a clear picture of intent. The jury convicted Brookie Lee West of first-degree murder, and she received life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2004, she filed for a retrial, claiming Christine had passed naturally in her sleep, but her request was denied. She currently remains incarcerated at Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Nevada, where in 2012 she attempted to escape by disguising her appearance and nearly making it to the facility's main entrance before staff recognized her. The case of Brookie Lee West raises uncomfortable questions about how family trauma cycles through generations, transforming victims into perpetrators. Her story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous inheritance isn't money or property, but the lessons we learn about love, loyalty, and what we're capable of doing to those closest to us. Danielle Nemitz. How do you measure the weight of a dream stolen? How do you calculate the value of a 19-year-old's future, of all the birthdays she'll never celebrate, of the family she'll never raise, of the career she'll never build? When we talk about lives taken too soon, we're not just talking about what was lost in that moment. We're talking about decades of possibility erased in an instant. And when the person holding that power is the one who promised to love and protect you, how do you even begin to make sense of such a betrayal? Danielle Rapien grew up in McKinleyville, California, where she was known for her bright spirit and infectious energy. She was a cheerleader at McKinleyville High School, the kind of young woman who lit up a room when she walked in. Her friends remember her as soft-spoken yet bubbly, someone who genuinely cared about the people around her. She had dreams like any teenager, dreams of building a life, of experiencing the world, of finding happiness. She also loved sharing beauty and makeup tutorials on her YouTube channel, connecting with others through her passion for creativity. When Danielle met Skylar Nemitz, a young man from nearby Arcata High School, it seemed like the beginning of a love story. They were high school sweethearts, and their relationship was described by those who knew them as intense and passionate. To Danielle, it felt like something out of a fairy tale. She believed she had found the person she would spend the rest of her life with, someone who would be her partner through all of life's adventures. In 2013, when Skylar joined the Army and was stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord near Lakewood, Washington, Danielle made a choice that countless military spouses make every day. She left behind her family, her friends, and everything familiar to follow the man she loved. They married, and Danielle threw herself into creating a home in their Lakewood apartment. While Skylar trained as an infantry specialist, Danielle worked to build their life together, navigating the challenges of being a young military wife far from home. But something darker was brewing beneath the surface of their relationship. Friends and family would later describe patterns of jealousy and control. Skylar reportedly had a fascination with firearms and kept multiple weapons in their apartment. The relationship that Danielle had believed would be her fairy tale was becoming something else entirely. On October 16, 2014, Skylar returned home from a training exercise. During his absence, Danielle had received a visit from an acquaintance who had brought her a bottle of cinnamon whiskey. It was a simple, innocent gesture, but when Skylar's co-worker mentioned this visit to him, everything changed. Witnesses reported that Skylar became visibly upset and furious upon learning that another man had been at his apartment while he was away. 2 hours later, 19-year-old Danielle Rapien Nemitz was sitting at her computer in their apartment. Her husband approached from behind, holding an AR-15 rifle. What happened next would end her life in an instant. A single shot struck Danielle in the back of the head, the bullet passing through and piercing the computer screen in front of her. She passed away immediately. Rather than call 911, Skylar took time to hide the magazine under the bed, placed the rifle in the closet, and flushed the bottle of whiskey down the toilet. He attempted to clean up the scene. When police finally arrived after a neighbor heard the gunshot and called for help, Skylar's story kept changing. First, he claimed Danielle had accidentally shot herself while cleaning the weapon. Then he said he was cleaning it and didn't know it was loaded. He told different versions to different people, unable to keep his account consistent. The evidence painted a clear picture. Danielle had been shot execution style while sitting at her computer. The autopsy showed the bullet had entered the exact center of the back of her head. Skylar, an infantry specialist with nearly 3 years of military experience and extensive firearms training, claimed it was an accident. But as Superior Court Judge Jack Nevin would later note at sentencing, this wasn't someone picking up a weapon for the first time. This was an expert who knew exactly what he was doing. The trial that followed was heart-wrenching for Danielle's family. Prosecutors sought a first-degree conviction, arguing that Schuyler had intentionally ended his wife's life out of jealousy and rage. The defense claimed it was a terrible accident. In February 2016, after more than a week of deliberation, the jury found Schuyler Nimitz guilty of first-degree manslaughter rather than the murder charge prosecutors had sought. On March 25, 2016, Schuyler received 13.5 years in prison, the maximum sentence for manslaughter, but far less than what Danielle's family felt justice demanded. For them, no sentence could bring back the vibrant 19-year-old whose life had been stolen from her while she sat peacefully at her computer, trusting the person who had vowed to cherish her. Danielle's story is a reminder that behind every headline about domestic situations that turn deadly, there's a real person with dreams, family who loved them, and a future that was taken away. Her Aunt Vera Schumert spoke of the pain that never goes away, the bad days and good days, and the wish that they could have their Danielle back. Family friend James Peltier created a Facebook page called Justice for Danielle Rapien Nimitz to keep her memory alive and to ensure that her story wouldn't be forgotten. Today, Danielle would have been 30 years old. Instead, her family visits a grave, remembers a cheerleader's smile, and mourns all the years they'll never have with her. Kelly Cochran. Can a marriage promise become a death pact? In the small town of Iron River, Michigan, neighbors thought they knew Kelly and Jason Cochran. They seemed like an ordinary couple trying to make ends meet in the Upper Peninsula. But beneath the surface of their relationship lay something darker than anyone could have imagined. A twisted agreement made on their wedding night would eventually claim 2 lives and possibly many more. Kelly Cochran was born in Indiana, where she grew up as neighbors with Jason. The two knew each other from childhood, and eventually their friendship turned into romance. In 2002, they married, and on that night, they allegedly made an unusual agreement. If either of them ever had an affair, that spouse would have to end the life of their lover or face consequences themselves. At the time, it might have seemed like an extreme expression of devotion. Years later, those words would transform into actions that would stun 2 states and launch one of the most complex investigations in recent memory. For over a decade, the Cochrans lived what appeared to be a normal life. Jason worked in manual labor, but his back eventually gave out after 10 years of hard work. The chronic pain became overwhelming, and he could no longer perform his job. Kelly took over as the primary breadwinner, paying bills and managing their household. The strain on their relationship grew. In 2013, they decided they needed a fresh start and moved to Iron River, Michigan. One reason for the move was so Jason could obtain medical marijuana to help manage his severe back pain, which was legal in Michigan but not in Indiana. Once settled in the Upper Peninsula, Kelly found work at a factory that manufactured parts for naval ships. There, she met Christopher Reagan, a 53-year-old Air Force veteran originally from Detroit. Reagan had settled in Traverse City after leaving military service and was dating a school teacher named Terry O'Donnell. Despite having a girlfriend, Reagan became involved with Kelly. What started as a workplace friendship evolved into something more. Kelly later described this relationship as the only bright spot in her life during those difficult years. The affair continued for months, and while Kelly claimed Jason knew about it and accepted the arrangement, interrogation videos would later suggest otherwise. Jason was deeply troubled by his wife's involvement with another man. The agreement they had made on their wedding night hung over them like a shadow. On October 14, 2014, Christopher Reagan went to the Cochran home. He would never be seen alive again. When Reagan disappeared, his girlfriend Terry O'Donnell knew immediately that something was wrong. She contacted authorities, who began investigating. Iron River Police Chief Laura Frizzo ran a small department of just 4 officers, but she was determined to find out what happened to Reagan. The investigation quickly focused on Kelly and Jason Cochran as persons of interest. Frizzo discovered that Kelly had been having an affair with the missing man, giving Jason a clear motive. But gathering enough proof to bring charges would take years of painstaking work. The Cochrans left Michigan shortly after investigators searched their home in March 2015. They returned to their hometown of Hobart, Indiana, hoping to escape the investigation. For nearly 2 years, they managed to stay ahead of authorities. Then, on February 20th, 2016, Kelly called 911, reporting that Jason wasn't breathing. When emergency responders arrived, they found Jason already deceased. The initial assumption was an accidental overdose, as Jason had been using substances to manage his pain. But an autopsy revealed he had died from asphyxiation, not an overdose alone. Detective Jeremy Ogden from the Hobart Police Department took on the case after receiving an anonymous tip connecting the Cochrans to an unsolved matter in Michigan. What followed was hundreds of hours of interviews, undercover tactics, and psychological maneuvering. Ogden knew he was dealing with someone highly intelligent and aware of investigative techniques. Kelly had studied psychology and human behavior, making her a formidable subject to interrogate. He had to gain her trust without alerting her to his true intentions. One of Ogden's most creative strategies involved observing Kelly's movements after Jason passed. He noticed she frequently visited a specific tree in a wooded area. Taking a calculated risk, he carved the words "Chris is here" into the tree, hoping to unsettle her psychologically. The tactic worked. That night, Kelly contacted Ogden and began revealing what had happened. According to Kelly's account, she had invited Reagan to her home, where Jason ended his life. She claimed she was forced to participate in concealing what happened, including removing evidence and helping dispose of his remains. She led authorities to a remote location in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where they found a skull with a bullet hole, along with eyeglasses belonging to Reagan. The teeth matched, confirming his identity. Kelly insisted she was a victim of her husband's jealousy and manipulation. But investigators weren't convinced. Chief Rizzo described interviewing Kelly as an exercise in separating truth from fiction. For every honest statement, there were multiple fabrications. Kelly eventually admitted that she had ended Jason's life herself by giving him a fatal dose and then suffocating him. She said it was revenge for taking away the one good thing she had in her life. In early 2017, Kelly stood trial for Reagan's passing. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found her responsible on all counts, including first-degree charges. She received life in prison without parole. The following year, she accepted a plea agreement for Jason's case, receiving an additional 65 years. She is currently serving her time at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan. But Kelly's story may not end there. Her brother has told authorities she may have been involved in as many as 9 additional cases across Michigan, Indiana, Tennessee, and Minnesota. As part of her plea agreement in Indiana, she cannot be prosecuted for any additional cases she reveals in that state. So far, she has not provided specific locations or identities of these alleged victims, leaving families and investigators with haunting questions about what else might be hidden. The case of Kelly Cochran raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of relationships and how trust can be weaponized. 2 men are gone. Families have been left without answers. And somewhere in the Midwest, there may be other victims waiting to be found. Larissa Schuster. How does a biochemist with knowledge of human anatomy and chemistry use her expertise not to heal, but to harm? In the quiet suburbs of Clovis, California, a woman with advanced scientific training and a thriving business stood at the center of a plot that would earn her one of the most disturbing nicknames in true crime history. The transformation from respected professional to someone capable of unspeakable actions raises questions about how intelligence, without conscience, can lead to tragedy. Larissa Foreman grew up on a farm in Clarence, Missouri, where she developed an early interest in science. She pursued biochemistry at the University of Missouri while working at a nursing home to support herself through college. It was there that she met Timothy Schuster, a nursing student who would become her husband in 1982. For the outside world, they appear to be a couple with promising futures. Both were educated, ambitious, and ready to build a life together. They would go on to have 2 children, Kristen and Tyler, and seemed to embody the American dream of professional success and family stability. In 1989, the Schuster family relocated to Fresno, California, where Larissa found work at an agricultural research laboratory. Her scientific skills flourished, and she eventually founded her own company Central California Research Laboratories. The business focused on analyzing agricultural products, and Larissa became known as a capable biochemist who managed complex testing procedures. Timothy, meanwhile, took on the role of stay-at-home parent, caring for their children while Larissa built her professional reputation. From the outside, the arrangement seemed to work well for their family structure. But beneath the surface, tension was mounting. In 2002, after nearly 20 years of marriage, the couple began divorce proceedings. What should have been a straightforward separation turned contentious almost immediately. Larissa was unhappy with the proposed division of assets and custody arrangements. She believed the house and business belonged to her alone and strongly opposed Timothy having custody of their son Tyler or even maintaining regular contact. Her attitude toward the separation revealed a side of her personality that few had seen before, one that refused to compromise or acknowledge Timothy's contributions to their family. After Timothy moved out, Larissa's behavior became increasingly concerning. She broke into his condominium to take items she claimed were hers, later bragging to her manicurist that she had convinced their son to steal from his father because the boy would do anything for her. She left threatening messages on Timothy's answering machine, messages so disturbing that he saved them. In these recordings, she called him names, wished harm upon him, and warned that consequences were coming. The venom in her voice shocked those who later heard the recordings during trial proceedings. Around the same time, strange things began happening at Central California Research Laboratories. In April 2003, a blue 55-gallon barrel was delivered to the facility, even though it wasn't the type the laboratory normally used. When asked about it, Larissa claimed it was for yard clippings, but she also asked an employee whether he thought a body would fit inside it. The employee assumed she was joking. She also mentioned multiple times that if she could take action against Timothy and avoid consequences, she would, and she once asked if the employee knew anyone who would rough up her estranged husband. Between June 13th and July 2nd, Larissa ordered unusual quantities of chemicals through the laboratory. Despite the fact that Central California Research Laboratories typically used very little hydrochloric acid throughout an entire year, Larissa placed orders for 3 cases of hydrochloric acid and 1 case of sulfuric acid in less than 3 weeks. She also ordered chloroform. Computer forensics would later reveal that someone using her office computer had conducted internet searches for terms related to dissolving tissue with acid. The pattern of preparation was becoming clear, though no one at the time connected these individual pieces into a complete picture. On July 9, 2003, Timothy Schuster disappeared from his Clovis home. When police investigated, they found his wallet, car keys, phone, and vehicle all at his residence. There were no signs he had packed to leave or plan a trip. 5 days later, employees from Central California Research Laboratories went to authorities with their concerns about Larissa's suspicious behavior and comments. That evening, investigators obtained search warrants for the storage unit Larissa had rented, her laboratory, and her home. Inside the storage unit, they discovered the blue barrel. Within it were human remains floating in liquid containing hydrochloric acid. Only the lower half of the body remained, as it had been placed into the barrel head first. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Timothy Schuster. Tissue samples tested positive for chloroform, and investigators concluded that the cause of passing was likely the combined effects of acute chloroform exposure and acid immersion, though it was possible the chloroform alone had been responsible. Larissa was arrested at the St. Louis airport on July 16th. She was charged with first-degree offense alongside James Fagon, a former laboratory assistant who confessed to helping her. At trial, Larissa took the stand in her own defense, claiming she had no foreknowledge of what happened and that Fagon was responsible. She admitted only to moving Timothy's body afterward. The jury did not believe her testimony. On December 12, 2007, Larissa was found responsible for first-degree actions with a special circumstance of doing so for material benefit. In May 2008, she received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her daughter Kristen told the judge at sentencing that she felt safer knowing her mother would remain incarcerated. Larissa currently serves her time at the California Institution for Women, having become known in media coverage as the Acid Lady. The case demonstrates how scientific knowledge meant to advance human understanding can be twisted toward destruction when combined with anger and self-interest. It also shows how warning signs, when viewed individually, can seem like jokes or exaggerations until they form a complete and terrible picture. For the Schuster family, and especially for Kristen and Tyler, the loss of their father and the actions of their mother left wounds that may never fully heal. Amanda Hayes. What happens when love, jealousy, and desperation collide in the darkest possible way? In a Raleigh apartment in 2011, a custody battle spiraled into something unthinkable, and at the center of it all stood a woman whose choices would shock the nation and haunt two families forever. Amanda Perry Hayes seemed, on the surface, to be building a new life. She had fallen in love with Grant Ruffin Hayes, a man who brought with him the complexities of a previous relationship and two young sons. When Amanda and Grant married in April of 2010, they were starting fresh, relocating from New York to North Carolina with hopes of securing custody of Grant's children. But beneath the surface of this new beginning, tensions were mounting. Laura Jean Ackerson, the mother of Grant's two boys, stood in their way, unwilling to simply fade into the background of her children's lives. The young mother from Kinston had her own dreams and her own fight. At just 27 years old, Laura was determined to remain an active presence in her sons' lives, despite the growing hostility from her ex-partner and his new wife. The custody arrangements had been contentious from the start, with weekends designated for Laura and weekdays for Grant. But as the dispute intensified, something far more sinister was taking shape in the minds of the Hayes couple. Financial pressures were crushing them. They faced eviction from their Raleigh apartment. Grant had already spent through Amanda's inheritance, pawning her expensive jewelry piece by piece. The stress was building, and Laura represented an obstacle they believed they could no longer tolerate. On July 13, 2011, Laura Ackerson made what would be her final trip to Raleigh. She had come to pick up her children, a routine exchange that should have ended with hugs and goodbyes. Instead, it ended in violence. What transpired in that apartment remains a matter of dispute between husband and wife, each pointing fingers at the other when their world came crashing down. But one fact is undeniable. Laura Ackerson never left that apartment alive. The aftermath of what happened that July day reveals the depth of planning and cold calculation that followed. The Hayes couple procured a power saw from a local Walmart, with surveillance cameras capturing Grant's casual demeanor as he selected blades, an eerie calmness that prosecutors would later argue suggested this was not his first act of violence. Laura's body was systematically cut into pieces, packed into coolers, and loaded into a rented U-Haul trailer alongside furniture meant to conceal the horrific cargo. Then came the long drive to Texas. Amanda's sister lived in Richmond, just outside Houston, and it was to her home that the couple headed with their grim load. Once there, they attempted to dissolve Laura's remains using muriatic acid, a desperate effort to erase all evidence of their actions. When the acid failed to accomplish their goal, they turned to nature for help. Taking a boat onto Oyster Creek, they dumped Laura's dismembered remains into the murky waters, hoping that the alligators known to inhabit those waters would consume what was left of the young mother. But bodies have a way of surfacing both literally and figuratively. Within weeks, workers discovered the first pieces of human remains in Oyster Creek. A torso, a lower leg. With the help of dive teams, a skull and thigh were recovered. The identity of these remains would soon be confirmed as Laura Ackerson, and the investigation would quickly focus on the last people known to have seen her alive. When authorities arrested Grant and Amanda Hayes 12 days after Laura's disappearance, Amanda was 5 weeks away from giving birth to a daughter. The couple each faced charges of first-degree murder, setting the stage for two separate trials that would captivate the nation and divide opinions about guilt and culpability. Grant Hayes went to trial first in September of 2013. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict him of first-degree murder, and he received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout his trial and in the years since, Grant has maintained that Amanda was responsible for Laura's passing, claiming he only helped with the aftermath because he loved his wife and wanted to protect her. Amanda's trial came in early 2014, and her defense painted a drastically different picture. Her attorneys argued that she was a victim herself, dominated and manipulated by a dangerous sociopath who had not only taken her inheritance, but had threatened her into compliance. Amanda testified that she had no knowledge of what had happened to Laura until they reached Texas, claiming Grant had threatened her with a machete and forced her participation in disposing of the body. She spoke of fearing for her own life and the lives of the children in their care. The jury, however, was not convinced. After more than 11 hours of deliberation, they found Amanda Hayes guilty of second-degree murder on February 19, 2014. She received a sentence of 13 to 16 and a half years in prison. But her story did not end there. Texas authorities pursued their own charges against her for tampering with evidence, specifically for her role in attempting to destroy and dispose of Laura's remains. In 2018, a Texas jury convicted her in just 90 minutes, and she received an additional 20 years to be served consecutively with her North Carolina sentence. Amanda Hayes now faces decades behind bars, her protestations of innocence falling on deaf ears. 2 young boys grew up without their mother. Multiple families were shattered by choices made in anger, desperation, and cold calculation. The question of who struck the fatal blow may never be definitively answered, but the courts have spoken clearly about Amanda's responsibility in the tragedy that unfolded that summer day in Raleigh. Rebecca Auburn. A hotel room door closing. A man thinking he's found companionship for the night. A drink offered, and then nothing. Just silence and an empty wallet where a life once was. How does someone become capable of turning human desperation into a death sentence? Not once, but 4 times over. The story of Rebecca Auburn forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, addiction, and the thin line between survival and destruction. In the span of 7 months, from December 2022 to June 2023, the streets of Northeast Columbus, Ohio became hunting grounds for a woman whose actions would earn her comparisons to one of America's most notorious female offenders. But unlike the sensationalized cases that dominate headlines, this one unfolded quietly in hotel rooms along Interstate 71, where desperation met calculation in the darkest possible way. Rebecca Auburn operated in the shadows of society, working in an industry where trust is currency and anonymity is armor. She met men who sought her services, men with families, jobs, and futures. Wayne Akin, 64 years old. Robert Snoke, 54. Joseph Crumpler, just 30. Guy Renda Jr., 42. These weren't just names on a police report. They were fathers, brothers, sons, people whose final moments would be spent in confusion and fear as the substance coursing through their veins shut down their systems. What makes someone cross that threshold? When does financial desperation transform into something far more sinister? Auburn's method was chillingly consistent. She would arrange meetings at hotels in the North Linden area, spaces where people come and go without questions, where surveillance cameras might miss crucial details, where a man's final hours could vanish into the anonymous fabric of transit lodging. She offered companionship. She offered escape. What she delivered was fentanyl, that synthetic predator that has claimed more American lives in recent years than any epidemic in modern memory. The pattern began with a survivor. On December 13, 2022, a man met Auburn and lived to tell his story. He woke up robbed but breathing. That encounter should have been a warning, a red flag in a system already overwhelmed by similar cases. But in cities across America, where overdoses have become tragically common, one more incident barely registers. It wasn't until Joseph Crumpler died on January 15, 2023 that the thread began to unravel. Yet even then, the connection wasn't immediate. How could investigators know they were looking at the beginning of something unprecedented in Columbus's recent history? Consider the psychological calculation required for what came next. After that first fatal encounter, Auburn didn't stop. She didn't flee. She continued. Robert Snoke died on April 1st. Wayne Akin received a substance that would end his life on April 13th. though he wouldn't die until 4 days later. His daughter, Kristen Crockett, would later reveal that she had heard whispers. A woman named Becca was responsible for multiple losses. She tried to push authorities to investigate. She felt the weight of being ignored until it was too late. How many families share that same frustration? That same helplessness when they sense something is terribly wrong but can't make anyone listen. By the time Guy Renda Jr. died on June 17, 2023, for men had lost their lives following encounters with the same woman. For families were planning funerals. 4 sets of friends were trying to make sense of endings that seemed senseless. And still, Auburn walked free until September of that year, when the Central Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force finally connected the devastating pattern. When authorities arrested her in September 2023, Auburn made a startling admission to detectives. She told them she had supplied drugs that caused a man's passing. She acknowledged taking his belongings while he lay unable to protect himself. That confession opened the floodgates. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, working alongside Columbus Police homicide detectives, built what Attorney General Dave Yost would later call an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming, so much so that when Auburn initially pleaded not guilty to 28 charges in October 2023, it seemed almost futile. The legal proceedings crawled forward with the weight that serious cases carry. Questions of competency were raised and settled. The court observed Auburn's demeanor, reviewed psychiatric evaluations, and determined she understood the gravity of what she faced. In February of 2025, a judge ruled her fit to stand trial. But by December 19, 2025, the chess match was over. Auburn entered guilty pleas to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of felonious assault. 23 other charges were dropped as part of the agreement. She faces up to 69 years to life in prison. Her sentencing is scheduled for February 20th, 2026. When that day arrives, a courtroom will hear from families who have lived with unbearable loss. They will speak for men who can no longer speak for themselves. And somewhere in that room, Rebecca Auburn will face the full weight of what those 7 months meant, not just for her, but for every life she extinguished in pursuit of whatever it was she thought she needed. Alicia Noel Murray. The grocery list was simple. Milk, bread, the ordinary things a husband picks up without question when his wife asks. Omar Murray had no reason to suspect that the moment he stepped back through his front door, his life would end in a hail of bullets orchestrated by the woman who once vowed to love him. How does a marriage transform from promises of forever into a cold calculation of dollars per life? When does a spouse stop seeing a partner and start seeing only an insurance payout? The death of 37-year-old Omar Murray on February 24th, 2013 exposed a conspiracy so calculated, so methodical in its progression from disappointment to determination to destruction, that it forced everyone who heard the story to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the person sleeping beside you is already planning your funeral. Alicia Noel Murray seemed to have built a respectable life. Trained as a registered nurse, employed by the Visiting Nurse Services of New York, married with a young child. Her existence appeared ordinary on the surface. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, resentment had taken root and grown into something far more dangerous. The marriage had deteriorated. Omar had betrayed her trust with a prostitute, and that betrayal became the spark that would eventually consume everything. The first attempt came in October 2012. Poison. She laced his dinner with a substance intended to end his life quietly, cleanly, without the mess of confrontation or divorce. But Omar survived. His body rejected what she had fed him, and he lived to see another day, completely unaware that his wife had just tried to end his existence. What goes through someone's mind when their first attempt fails? Does it give them pause, or does it simply become a problem requiring a different solution? For Alicia Noel Murray, the answer was clear. If poison wouldn't work, she needed something more direct. She began an affair with Damian Lovell, and during their time together, she confided her darkest desire. She wanted her husband gone. Not divorced, not separated, gone. And she had a reason beyond anger or betrayal. She revealed to Lovell that she was the beneficiary of 3 separate life insurance policies on Omar's life, totaling nearly $900,000. She presented her husband's existence as an obstacle to financial freedom, a problem worth solving through violence. Lovell agreed to help. On February 6, 2013, he made the first attempt. He took a shot at Omar, but missed. The bullet went wide, and once again, Omar Murray walked away from an attempt on his life without even knowing how close he had come to dying. 2 failures. 2 chances for Alicia to reconsider, to step back from the edge. But reconsideration was not in her nature at that point. Her focus had narrowed to a single outcome, and she was willing to pay for it. Enter Kirk Porteous. Lovell recruited him for the job and provided him with a $500 down payment and a gun, both supplied by Alicia. The total promise payment was $3,500, a pittance compared to the $900,000 she expected to collect. The plan was set. Omar would be sent on an errand, and when he returned, Porteous would be waiting. On that February afternoon, Alicia sent her husband to the grocery store. It was such a mundane request, the kind of thing that happens in households across the country every single day. Omar left to pick up a few items. When he returned to their home at 204 Lott Avenue in Brownsville, Kirk Porteous was inside, positioned near the entrance. As Omar stepped through the doorway, Porteous fired 3 times. Omar Murray collapsed just feet inside his own home, his life ending in the space he should have felt safest. Upstairs, Alicia waited with their 10-month-old baby, listening to the sounds that marked the success of her plan. She didn't rush to his side. She didn't call for help in a panic. She simply waited for it to be over. And when it was, she moved forward with the next phase, cashing in. Within days of her husband's passing, she attempted to collect on the insurance policies, as if his body being barely cold was no obstacle to her financial recovery. For over a year, investigators could not connect her to the crime. During that time, Alicia remarried, moving on with her life while Omar's family grieved and sought answers. But eventually, the investigation led to Damian Lovell, and Lovell, facing serious charges, made a deal. He would testify against both Alicia and Kirk Porteous in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years to life. The trials were held separately. Kirk Porteous was convicted by one jury. Alicia Noel Murray was convicted by another, and it took that jury only 3 hours to reach their verdict. On June 29, 2017, Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Neil Feiertag sentenced both defendants to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Alicia stood stone-faced as the sentence was handed down. Her lawyer insisted she was innocent. Omar's family erupted in applause. His cousin read a letter from his Jamaican-born mother. "Alicia, you can spend the next 900,000 years in prison, one for each dollar you thought you'd get for my son's life." As of today, Alicia Noel Murray remains incarcerated, maintaining her innocence while serving a sentence that will end only with her last breath. A permanent reminder that greed, when allowed to fester, can transform a person into something unrecognizable.